Hello everyone and welcome back to biology. Like I mentioned before, we are actually continuing with our lesson on worms, but today we're going to be talking about the different ways these three different types of worms feed and reproduce. To start, we're going to begin with the flatworm. Now, feeding for a flatworm. A flatworm feeds off of either dead or very slow moving animals. Now, because of its structure, whenever it is able to go, like let's say there's a corpse of a roadkill, okay? Something was run over on the road and let's say a flatworm got to it, however it did. When it is on top of the body, you remember that the flatworm actually has a mouth. Now it has a lot of different little parts, but it does not have an anus, which is where it would secrete or take out the waste, right? So the thing about this type of worm, so because of its structure, whenever it's on top of like its food, technically, the way it moves is what allows it to take stuff in, so to take in the food. But the same way it goes in is the same way waste comes out. Interesting, right? Reproduction for flatworms is also different. Flatworms reproduce asexually, so it doesn't need a male and a female, but they actually reproduce by fission. Okay, that's this one. Fission. What this means is that the worm, or pretty much any organism that does this, this is what it does, fission, okay? So let's say there is one worm. This worm actually starts to create a double of itself and starts to split in the middle of it. So I'm going to insert an image up next of what that looks like. So pretty much it'll just start growing another head, another body, mouth, whatever, and it'll start splitting until it makes its own self. It's itself. Okay, so that's an interesting way of how flatworms also reproduce. Let's go ahead, see that clip, and then move on. Alrighty, then our next worm is the roundworm. How this worm feeds itself. Now, this worm, it doesn't sound too weird or anything like that, not like our flatworm, but pretty much how the roundworm eats is that food and nutrients go in through the mouth, and through the digestive tube, the food is actually absorbed by the worm's body. So anything that cannot be digested, so pretty much like if it digested everything it ate, nothing would come out. Like there would be no waste. But if there is any food that the worm wasn't able to digest or anything like that, it would actually be exposed through the anus. A roundworm does have one. Now, a reproduction of roundworms. It can get a little tricky. So, roundworms actually reproduce sexually, so there are female and male worms. Okay, so let's take an example of parasite. Remember how we talked about how some roundworms are parasites? Okay, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's lombrices. So let's say that there are both male and female living inside of a host, which in this case would be humans' intestines. So, this is drawing right here. Okay, let's say these are intestines, and there is a whole bunch of worms living here. Now, let's say that, again, we have both female and male worms in the intestines. So females obviously produce eggs and males obviously produce sperm. So when the sperm reaches the egg and is able to fertilize it, it is actually, when it's in the intestines and it's able to be fertilized, what happens is that the eggs are exposed from the body with waste. So we all know how that happens, right? So it'll leave our body through waste. And eventually, one way or another, these eggs will find a new host. Okay? Now, once the eggs find a new host, their way in there somehow, once they find their way into a new host, and let's say we have a new intestine of a different host. Okay, let's say this one looks like this. And so our eggs arrive to our host. Once inside the new host, these eggs hatch and release new worms, new parasites, and the process repeats itself. Okay, so parasites are commonly known, roundworms parasites are commonly known to only be able to reproduce when inside of a host. So pretty much if there are parasites, let's say in the water or anywhere, and that's not inside of a host, another organism, not necessarily just humans, they can be in animals and whatnot, just another living organism. So if they are not inside of a host, they cannot produce those eggs and those sperm to be able to reproduce. So pretty much when they die, they just die. They couldn't reproduce unless they get inside of a host, and then they reproduce like crazy. And again, like I said, when the eggs leave the body through waste, they find their way inside of a new host, and when inside of the host, the eggs are able to hatch. Okay, that's a little tricky, but keep that in mind. Let's move on to our very last type of worm is our segmented worm. Now, a segmented worm, like I mentioned before, our most well-known segmented worm is actually the earthworm. And how the earthworm feeds itself is it feeds itself while it's moving through the soil. So you know these worms live in the soil. So as it's moving, it's just pretty much swallowing soil through its mouth. But it's not getting the nutrients and food it needs from the soil. What it's doing is pretty much putting everything in its mouth, and as the soil is traveling through the body of the segmented worm, the body is absorbing and separating the food from the soil. So whatever the worm does not need, it will leave as waste through the anus of the segmented worm. And actually, the waste of an earthworm is actually extremely good for plant growth. And also because of the earthworms moving through the soil, it loosens it up and makes it a better a better area for plant growth. So that's a fun fact about earthworms. Now, reproduction of a segmented worm is actually sexual, like our roundworms, but it doesn't need to go through the whole process like roundworms do, or parasites specifically. So actually, segmented worms do reproduce sexually. They have the male and female sex cells, and that is how they reproduce in the earth. Okay? Very well. Now, for your assignment today, I'm going to insert a clip that is going to give you pretty much a chart, which is going to tell you the main points of each type of worm. The flatworm, segmented worm, and the roundworm. Okay? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to copy down that chart as well as the example of what fission is and what it looks like. Okay? So that's important to know because it'll help you remember that word, fission. Okay? Now, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate and ask. I'm here to help. I hope you all have a very wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to be hearing back from everyone very, very soon. Goodbye.